Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Markku, there you are. I heard that the other person that should be commenting this couldn't come, so we have half an hour time. Maybe you, Antti, will help me here. In the first instance, I was not sure what to do here when I got the invitation, so I didn't really plan any questions. But now hearing Bo, your interesting presentation, some questions also came up. I could say, firstly, I think that those thoughts that you now presented, in a certain way, they are familiar for me, perhaps through Rudolf Steiner's philosophy. They are very, very close in many ways. We can come back to that. And there was a clear line of thought also, I think, especially now when you presented it. First, when I read the paper, I didn't see it so clearly. It was quite dense in a certain way. But I start with some thoughts that I had here when I read your paper in this weekend and put them. So I will start by reading some of my thoughts, and then we come back to the questions. Okay. Firstly, yeah. Also, I think I have to say that Bo Dahlin is perhaps one of the, I could say, the leading academic writer on Steiner education in the Nordic countries, because we haven't had very many of these persons now, especially now being active. Of course, Reijo Vilenius has been one in Finland and in the Nordic countries, but the change that has been taking place, I think, the last 10 years, 15 years, that there are serious articles nowadays about Steiner education in relation to general educational issues. I think Bo Dahlin has a big impact in that. Maybe I should stand up because... Okay. I think the reason for the quite reluctant reading of Steiner education in the academic community, it has to do, of course, with the topic here today. It's spirituality. And spirituality can be, of course, there can be many interpretations about it. And as Bo, I think, convincingly shows also, there is a strong tendency towards a quite materialistic or at least non-spiritual paradigm in science today. And also including education, where I working myself, there is perhaps a tendency to avoid ontological questions, because if you state really deep ontological questions about reality, you might get into troubling questions as well. So it might be good. I can sense in today's world of education a very pragmatic culture, that that the findings you come to, they have to work, and stating very deep questions might disturb this thing. Dahlin refers to Edmund Husserl's claim in his last book. I think you do it very well. Also, where this kind of hegemony of naturalistic thinking implies that the not natural sciences are on a lower level, that we have this kind of objectivistic natural sciences that are real science, and then we have another forms of sciences that has to made their existence, but they are not that good and real sciences as the natural sciences. And I think this was one of the big questions, of course, in the phenomenological movement. But there was a very different time in the beginning of the 19th century, because all the social sciences and human sciences hadn't really established a scientific groundwork yet. So today we live in a very different time in a certain sense. Nobody asks or raises the question, is education a real science, or is psychology a real science? But that question was very actual in the beginning of the 20th century. And I think that the phenomenological movement was very, very important in a certain sense, turning the attention, giving an alternative to objectivistic outlook of science. And I think Bo Dahlin starts very nicely in showing how Husserl was the leading figure in combating this kind of naturalism. It made me think about an author that I also admire. I think that Bo also mentioned his name. His name is Owen Barfield. You probably have read it or know his name. He was born actually 1898 and lived almost as 100 years old before he died in the late 20th century. And he had a wonderful way of contextualizing also Steiner's thought in a similar way that Bo has, with scientific progress in the last 100, 200 years. So I will say something about this Barfield because I think he's very relevant in this context in a certain way. The starting point for Barfield is that he states this in his probably most read book, Saving the Appearances. It's a nice book I think it's from the 1950s, 40s, 50s, I don't remember. He says that the modern conception of reality, also the one that we usually share, it rests on two unquestioned presuppositions. One is an omission. What is it in Finnish, omission? Something you don't see, you turn it away. The other one is an assumption. So one omission and one assumption. The omission part is about how we conceive our knowledge process. When we gain knowledge about our surrounding world, we easily think that our knowledge about the world is something very independent of ourselves. But then we don't see, or we omit the fact that the world that we meet, as Bo also said, as sensations, always appears to us in relation to some sort of activity from our side. So every time we meet the world or perceive something, there are thoughts, feelings, or imagination involved. And there's some kind of activity from our part. If there is no activity, then we don't perceive anything. Then we're, well, I suppose, sleeping. And if we don't come to see that this thinking or this activity is involved in our observation and perceptions, we might think that there is a pure objective word going on there, independent of ourselves. And this is, of course, a supposition that is very common in the history of natural sciences. And this also leads easily to the thought that our consciousness is a thing among the other things, that everything in the world can be objectified. So our thinking and our consciousness could also be a part of it. But I think Bo shows very nicely, and the phenomenological movement has as its starting point that you cannot take the consciousness and objectify it as a thing and look at our consciousness in the same way as I look at the tables or the chairs or you as people. And this is also close to what Husserl calls a natural attitude to the world that we have, or what Steiner calls as a naive realism that we just experience the world as a subject and object, and everything can be objectified. So the school of phenomenology, is a philosophical movement that successfully shows the impossibility of such a stance. The other question, the kind of assumption, that's perhaps more controversial in a way. I think we can all, in today's science, it's not so dramatic things, this starting point that our consciousness cannot be objectified. It's a certain matter or also what we do with this knowledge. Do we get it, or do we take an interpretation of something spiritual, look at it from a spiritual paradigm, or do we look at it from a kind of human science paradigm, where we don't need to lean necessarily on something, as you would say, Bo, objective spiritual, spiritual going on in the world. It's only a subjective thing. It's a very Kantian thought, this. But coming to the other unquestioned presupposition that Barfield had, it's also linked to the basic thinking of Rudolf Steiner. Barfield says that we usually, in looking at we usually conceive the relationship between human beings to our surrounding world as something stable and unchanging. We also think that people in earlier times understood and looked upon her surrounding world in the same way as we do as modern people. That the relationship between subject and object is something stable. And this is actually very, very interesting because then we can come to the conclusion that the difference between me and the person living 5,000 years ago is only that I have more knowledge. I can count on better conclusion that the persons 5,000 years ago did because he or she did not have the same amount of knowledge that I have. But according to Barfield, and especially according to Steiner as well, the difference, there is a evolving thing going on in the relationship between the subject and the world. And as Barfield says, he argues very strongly that earlier people inhabited the world in a different way, and human self-consciousness is not something that has been there from the beginning. It's something that appeared on the scene at a quite late stage. So Barfield speaks about, he uses the term RUP, a residue of unresolved positivism, with those two things working in our modern culture as a subconscious stream of thought. And even if we resist positivism, I don't think there's anybody serious science, working in science, that would claim that the classical positivism is the only right thing for science. We all, in somehow, feel that it's a very narrow thing to look through that glasses. But still, Barfield's point is that that as a subconscious stream we have those thoughts in some way working in our knowledge or seeing in our knowledge. So so this subjective consciousness with thoughts and feelings, in earlier times they were not being felt as private as they are felt nowadays. So we're, in a certain way, we're caught in our subjectivity. And as I feel now that your presentation, Bo, is a kind of invitation that we should start to look we should try to get out of this Kantian trap and seeing spirituality also, or consciousness, as something subjective, and instead try to go back to the world where we have come from, but we're now locked into this kind of subjective consciousness, and all the kind of examples that you gave were examples where our subjective consciousness is getting broader. It comes into the world in a different way. And I must point out, because this was one of my themes also in the study that I did on Steiner's early thinking, that the romantic thinkers, as you mentioned, were very aware of this, or they made this as a major cultural problem, that how can we escape and come away from this subjective dead end that Kant has led us. So, what time it is? It's timeless for me. Oh,
8 minutes.
8 minutes. Oh, yeah. Please.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Maybe some very quick comments, and maybe let Bo as well answer to our commentary before we continue. So I make lots of notes during your presentations, and since we only have a very short window of time for comments and questions, then very short question or comment to what you were presenting. Thinking about the transformation that Husserl was after when he criticized the kind of the reductionism of the natural sciences and the kind of epistemic attitude that they brought with them, and knowing that you have studied Jung as well. When you open the space for kind of a more spiritual kind of an exploration of the mind, where does this leave us with the concept and notion of the unconscious? Does it fit into what Steiner was doing, and does it fit with Merleau-Pontian ideas? And can it be kind of an connected to this kind of a contemplative approach to studying the mind?
I think the idea of the unconscious, from this point of view, you must sort of relativize it. And you might even make a distinction between the subconscious unconscious and the superconscious unconscious. Because the subconscious is usually memories and dreams and things in a way that we have forgotten, and that we have forgotten that we have forgotten, as Sartre says, but that still exists somehow. But the superconscious is not like that. The superconscious is more like abilities, like thinking, as I was talking about. Thinking is, to begin with, a superconscious activity. But all this is relative, because anything that is unconscious can become conscious through different, through meditation, for instance. Meditation is a way to go into both directions, both into the superconscious, into pure thinking, as Steiner calls it, or sometimes when you do this kind of mindfulness meditation and you achieve some kind of inner peace, and then memories come up, you know, memories that you haven't thought of maybe for a long time, but that somehow strikes you as significant. It's like almost like you do your own psychoanalysis, almost. But yeah, was that something?
Thank you. I think we have just a few minutes for audience, 5 minutes for audience discussions, audience questions, and then Bo's comments. Tony, first.
Yes, Bo. Hello. Can you tell us more about Husserl, and why didn't, in your opinion, Husserl continue into spiritual dimensions as Steiner? I get to know, I'm not a Husserl specialist, but I get the notion that he sort of stopped in a very abstract spirituality. Can you comment on this?
Yes. I'm not an expert on Husserl either, so my comments are not very long. I mean, it's a
little bit more voice, can I ask?
Is it? Hello? Okay. I have the same impression as you, that he stayed in a kind of abstract spirituality, because he was so concerned with mapping out the acts of consciousness in a very detailed and sometimes rather trivial ways, I think. So, but why he did that, I don't know. I have to confess ignorance.
Okay, we had on the back one question, please. Yeah.
Yeah. If reality is real when we are active in it in many different ways, how does it affect consciousness when we are in virtual reality? Or is there even consciousness in these different forms of concept-made virtual realities?
Is it virtual reality?
Yeah. Can there be like consciousness there also?
Yeah, I doubt that, you know. I have read Ray Kurzweil's Singularity is Near, you know that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's... I find it hard to believe that we can sort of connect our brain to the internet and then access the internet directly. Because, and I make a parallel to what some people, some spiritual teachers say, you know, that if your higher knowledge centers wake up before you are prepared for it, you will go unconscious. And I imagine that you would go unconscious if you somehow manage to connect your brain to the internet. You would also go unconscious. Because all this information will just drown you.
Okay.
That's my belief. But
I wanted to ask you, you didn't mention hermeneutic. And when we think about the hermeneutic turn, which is developing this circle of understanding, before understanding, and which I have understood, it's like a effort to try to solve this problematic subject-object when we are creating, like you were describing, through the participation, so that this understanding is like a spiral which is going on. So do you think it's a fruitful turn to this in this connection or in this process?
It could be. I mean, if you look at Gadamer's hermeneutics, and he talks about play, even you have to engage yourself with the text. I mean, in German it's Spiel, which is not only play; it's more like. But it's rather similar to participating. But the thing is, it's focused on text. So it's not so much. It could be maybe applied also to other phenomena, but yes, but there's something participatory in it.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Eva.
Thank you very much for your intriguing presentation. It was fascinating. As a trainer of Tai Chi for 16 years, I was especially interested in your terms of Qi. And what I can say of the training period or weekly basis for 16 years is that I would call it psychological experiences which come first to as an experience of long time expression. I wouldn't say they are spiritual. They can be named as spiritual, but the results of training are in the first. Firstly, are psychological, because that Tai Chi is training your body, and it gives some kind of vital energy to you, but it manifests itself in psyche. And I also I wondered why there wasn't any difference between psyche and spirit, as you used your terms. You didn't made any differences between these two levels of mind.
So I'm not sure I understood the question right. The first question you said?
According to my own experience, the results of long-term Tai Chi training, which is Chinese form of
yes, I also practice it.
Yes, okay. Okay. So the result I noticed first was on the psychological level.
Yes.
And the second question was that I didn't hear that you made any difference between psyche and spirit.
Yeah. Well, for me it's natural that the results are psychological, because mind and body are one. When I talk about the lived body in Merleau-Ponty sense, the lived body includes the mind. There's no so. It's about this connection between tensions in the body, for instance. The release of tensions can make you feel different. If you have been carrying an unconscious tension for most of your life, and that tension suddenly releases you, that does not only affect the body, but you feel different, I would say.
So is that psychic? Or psychological, or is it spiritual?
That's psychological, first of all. Yeah.
Can I just make one small one?
Very small one. Then we have to take a break.
you. First of all, there was something you mentioned at some point referring to Goethe, saying that Goethe said something like that the human being itself is a perfect instrument for observation, or used as an observation. I think
For research.
For research. So can you say something more about that? Because I have an assumption what Goethe might have thought, but I like to hear a little bit more what you think, that what did he actually mean by it?
For me, I'm not sure what Goethe would have said, but for me it has to do with this slowing down of perception. I thought that is something that you have to cultivate consciously, intentionally.
Yeah.
But it can eventually become sort of an ability in you. And that slowing down the perception opens up new aspect to things, not only in the physical world, also in thinking. You know? So I think Goethe was onto that, although he didn't speak exactly that way. But that's what he meant. He certainly meant cultivating, keeping on observing weather, for instance, every day, looking at the weather, at the sky a certain time of the day. Do that for long periods of time, and you start to get a feeling for how does the weather change. And he could even predict the weather next day, it said.
Yeah. Yeah, good.